Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. With this video series, I'll be analyzing and discussing Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden, one chapter at a time. Now, at the time of these recordings, we have not yet run our campaign, but obviously I've thoroughly read the book. And unlike my crafting series, these videos will offer general criticisms and advice without necessarily taking a deep dive into the specific changes and modifications I would make for my personal campaign. A warning before we begin, should be obvious, but these videos will be full of spoilers. They are for DMs only. If you are playing Rime of the Frostmaiden or you plan on playing Rime of the Frostmaiden, please do not watch these videos, but feel free to send your DM this way, or after you have played it, then come join me and see my general breakdown. This video is going to be Chapter 4, Destruction's Light. I am very proud of Rime of the Frostmaiden for allowing the story to execute a huge, climactic, nearly apocalyptic event fairly early on in the story to where the players can't necessarily prevent it, but they can certainly still affect it and be heroes during the actual event. Now, the chapter itself is 10 pages long. This is like the opposite of, chapter 1 and 2, which are a bazillion pages long because there's like 10 locations for all of them. Chapter 4 technically doesn't even offer any new locations. It's just the event of the Shardolin dragon escaping from Sunblight and systematically destroying the Ten Towns region, which we can go ahead and click to that. So I don't have a specific map for that, although I can show you the dragon flight path map. But you're basically just using this region map, and then you're using the town maps, although I would suggest, and obviously here I'm using Roll20, if you are using some kind of virtual tabletop or your party likes using maps, definitely have at least one town map of some sort there, and probably worth having two versions of that map, one of which is a pre-destruction and one of them is post-destruction, depending on how your players want to handle this. And this chapter may be one of the most complicated to actually run effectively because so much of it depends on the choices your characters make. Now, hopefully you've already seen my video on Chapter 3, and you've seen how I feel about the timing with the dragon being released and the players showing up at Sunblight. As a lot of DMs have said before me, and will continue to say after me, do not run that as written. Do not have your players show up to Sunblight and have the dragon leave, and they have to make a horrible choice there on whether to basically do Chapter 3 or Chapter 4. That's dumb. It's bad design. Don't do that. And I'll briefly touch on what I said in Chapter 3, but you should make that the climactic event of Chapter 3 where they make it to Xardarok, and either through the fault of the players or because Xardarok is just prepared for it, have him pull the lever, and then the dragon escapes towards the end of that dungeon. Hopefully your players have, mostly cleared it out, and then they can clean up that chapter. If you want Xardarok to escape, he can, but the interesting thing is his story is basically done at that point. Like, his whole point was just to release this dragon, destroy 10 towns. He's technically going to do that, so it actually works better narratively, although I'd be interested if any of you have plans to actually include Xardarok in later of the campaign. Narratively, it's okay to kill him off, because it's the dragon that's actually the main threat in the Ten Towns region. So Chapter 4 is all about when your players have to leave Sunblight and go to Ten Towns. Now, as written in the book, that's when they meet Valine, who is a very important character in the story. She's a member of the Arcane Brotherhood. She's basically the primary quest-giving NPC for the entire rest of the campaign, and she even has a really funny, like, video game-esque, like, she cannot die because she's that important of an NPC. She basically tells the players, like, where they can find Auril's abode and how to get into she tells them about the entire plot of the rest of the story, which is that you're supposed to go into the Ethrin City and, under the glacier and all that. So, obviously I have very strong feelings about how to change all that, but just sticking to Chapter 4, I would recommend having Valine actually, assuming you're going to still use her, having Valine maybe show up at a better, more heroic moment to, like, help the players fight off the dragon. Make it so instead of it being very sus when she shows up like, I can help you, bring you to, the Ten Towns region much faster with my zombie kobolds. Like, a lot of the players are going to be cocking an eyebrow at that. Instead, have her be a hero alongside the players. Now, You do not obviously want to outshine the players unless they are struggling and they're thinking, oh god, I guess we have to sacrifice ourselves to help the town or something. Then you can have her show up as a helper NPC. But use her to kind of help whatever town they decide to go in and make their last stand. Have Valine there, and she finally reveals herself because this is just a big climactic moment that's going to destroy everybody. So. And that way she can be put on the player's good graces. Maybe she helps a player, or the players see her. And she's not necessarily a good person in terms of on the alignment scale. She doesn't really care about necessarily helping others, but it's in her own best interest that Ten Towns does not be destroyed right now. At least that's how I would do it. So there is a big deal in terms of the distance that players can travel and how quickly they can get back to Ten Towns. I haven't really done the math or looked at the rate at which they can travel. I know the actual travel rate seems to be really wonky in this game, or in terms of it takes this long on foot and this long on sleds. I'm tempted to increase a lot of that, at least in my game, so that we don't have a lot of tedious travel time, because that's something that my group particularly doesn't really enjoy. And you can see that Sunblight initially is all the way down here, and if they make a straight shot, we're looking at maybe 4 miles, and then they could go all the way north to East Haven. That's another 12 miles. I mean, it just seems like it takes hours and hours and hours. And by then, it kind of depends on where the players show up. They may always be behind the dragon. A really important piece of information that your players should get, but they may not get, is the dragon's flight path, which is something that's very easy to get in Sunblight. My only misgiving about this is it does put Sunblight on the map, so if you plan on moving Sunblight somewhere in your campaign, you either have to redo this map or just not use it, because it obviously puts a direct arrow right there. But it's fun because then the players have the information about where the dragon is going and how to plan for that. And it even mentions that a lot of folks are saying, well, we're all going to flee to Bryn Shander, and because that's the most protective city. And it turns out that would be playing right into Zardarok's hands, because he has actually planned for this. He's pre-programmed the dragon to take this long counterclockwise path in the goal of destroying all the outer cities, having all these refugees show up in Bryn Shander, and then the dragon just attacks and kills everybody in Bryn Shander. Which, if you're following the events of the book and your players technically do nothing, then that's literally what happens. Every single town the dragon shows up at, it spends anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours, depending on if it's a tiny village or if it's a larger, I don't even know if city is the right term, but a bigger town like an East Haven or a Bryn Shander, maybe 6 or 8 hours, and it destroys most of the town and anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of the population, which is it's apocalyptic. If you think about the actual decimation of numbers, is really crazy. So it's a huge event. It's one that I think you should absolutely pull off. It's very satisfying in a very dark, serious way that is kind of like the turning point of the campaign. Even though the goal is for your players to eventually... first of all, we assume your players, if you follow my instructions, they already defeated Zardarok and basically cleared most of Sunblight out, and now they just have to go stop this dragon. How do they actually stop this dragon, though? And this is something that's very disappointing in the story, in the book as written, is it doesn't really explain what kind of defenses these towns have. It mentions, we do have numbers of militia, but for example, in Targos, it mentions the fact that they can bring siege weapons to bear, but it doesn't have any stats or numbers or any information on what those siege weapons are. So as a DM, you're going to have to do some extra legwork to figure out how exactly these towns are actually mounting defenses and what's going on, because ideally your players are going to pick at least one of these locations to have a showdown with the dragon. And it could be really interesting is if you don't try to do this all in one session, and instead it ends up being a several session event, especially if your players end up maybe fighting the dragon at one time, figuring out what its capabilities are, where that it prefers not to even land but just fly around out off in the distance. Let's pull up the dragon's stats here and we can look at it, but I think it's got a really good flying speed and it can pretty much stay out of range. Let's go creatures. I think it's under, is it under C for Shardland Dragon? Maybe it's under named NPCs then, or my undername. It might be under named NPCs. All right, let's scoot down. Where are you? Shardland Dragon. There we go. So we'll look at the character sheet. Yeah, it's a flying speed of 90, and for a lot of the towns, it mentions its tactics. It doesn't mention this for all the towns, but for most of them, where it literally just flies around because it can fly indefinitely and just waits for its waits if you're out of combat, whatever. for its Radiant Breath to recharge, and just does that because it's got a 120-foot range. So it can stay very far out of range and still deal a lot of damage. Now, interesting is it is a beam attack. It's not a breath. It's a beam. It's a laser beam. It's a 5-foot wide laser of 120-foot range. So just a really long... If you picture that villain in the first Thor movie, the Destroyer, and in fact the helmet's even very similar to what the dragon's got here, where it just has that kind of thing. That's exactly what this thing is doing. So I don't know how the players face that. I think they're around level 6, I want to say, for this. So maybe they've got some flight spells capability, and obviously some long range spells would probably do it pretty good. But this is meant to be a pretty challenging fight that's not necessarily a straight up fight, although it could be very interesting if your players decide to, for example, use siege weapons, so maybe ballistas. How much do those do? Can somebody get a net going? How do you fight a dragon that's programmed? It's a construct, so it's not going to feel like fear or pain or anger. You can't really goad it into stuff. It's not going to make mistakes. But it's also got a pre-programmed path where it's going to try to destroy as much of the town as possible. So how much of it is actually going to be like turning to attack anybody who's attacking it versus just indiscriminately attacking left and right? Which means, to me, you need to build this encounter or series of encounters as more environmental and more other things happening rather than just a straight up... If you're doing a straight up combat fight between your players and the dragon, I think you failed somewhere. Unless it is the culmination of different events happening and you finally bring the dragon down and it's gonna fight till its last breath, I guess. Although I think it mentions once it's done destroying everything, it hightails it back to Sunblight. If nobody's there to repair it, it just shuts down. So that seems a little narratively dissatisfying, though, versus trying to destroy that dragon. But look at its stats. I mean, it's got damage resistance to non-magical. At this point, some of your party might have magical weapons, some might not. It's immune to a lot of conditions. It's immune to cold and poison. It's got a 17 armor class, which is pretty dang high. Hit points aren't actually crazy for CR11, but still average about 150. And then, as I mentioned, if it's in the air, it's actually only doing its Radiant Blast. So it can't actually do... I mean, it takes a while for it to destroy things. Every single blast is basically going to destroy, a structure, a building, or whatever. Anybody caught in there is going to get destroyed. But only when it lands can it actually deal a lot of damage. And if you look at here, it does 3 attacks as its multi-attack, 2 claws and a tail, and if it's not flying, it also does its wing attack. That's 4 attacks, each of which have an average of 15 damage. So if your players are actually walking up to this thing while it's running around and it notices them or something, they're donezo. It's going to get them. It does have magic resistance, which is important to note, so it always has resistance on all the saves and things your players do. And anybody within 30 feet has to make a DC 16 Wisdom saving throw or be charmed, and as a free action, it can direct charmed targets to attack other targets, so it can have this really awesome berserker effect around it, which comes in very handy if you're looking for other events to do while trying to defend the town against this monster. And the chapter actually does list several things. It's under the section Other Things Characters Can Do, which is what you should be looking at. You should be running this as a series of events rather than a straight up combat fight. So, for example, your players could be the hero thing, be Marvel superheroes or DC or whatever you're into. They could, save people from collapsing buildings. They could just tend to injured people. They could be rushing them away from something. Treat this as kind of a almost like a big environmental hazard with people just running and screaming. I mean, imagine if you're in that episode of Game of Thrones with the dragon going down King's Landing, just roasting everybody. We won't get into Game of Thrones, but just bear with me here. And you're actually one of the people on the ground, but you have the power and capability. Yeah, you could maybe try and fight this powerful dragon, or if you were a good person, you would be helping people. And that's something that I would definitely encourage my players to do. And even if they don't necessarily help people, you can include other events, and the story gives them to you in the form of the Dwergar. The Dwergar are in most of the towns. I want to say they're in primarily all the big towns. I believe there are invisible Dwergar hanging out in East Haven, which is the East Haven Ferry, although your players may have cleared that one out. I believe it mentions there's saboteurs in Tourmaline where they collapse a mine. There's some in Bryn, Shander, and Targos. And then, of course, they're in Caer Denivel. They're actually inside of an abandoned inn or something. And anywhere that has those Dwergar can pose an extra problem I mean, it's almost just insult to injury because the dragon's already doing so much damage. In fact, at one point it mentions the refugees from Caer Konig, flee to go south to get to Bryn Shander, but they have to obviously go through Caer Dineval, and the Dwergar, they're just waste them. Like, it's just awful. They're just refugees trying to escape with their lives, and they run into these invisible Dwergar. So, but that provides another avenue for your players, which is why you want to have those maps ready for battle maps. You can have this dragon freaking in the background just destroying buildings, and your players are like helping people and maybe, trying to help organize militia and doing these things, and then you can have a combat encounter in the middle of all that, and then, at like round 2, have the dragon come by and strafe and just do like a laser blast just right down a line, maybe hit, a player and a dwerg or something, and just make it so that's almost a non-combatant, that dragon flying in the air. I mean, still maybe put on initiative order and stuff, but have the players actually concentrate on other events, and then, after a time, it can do more things, and then it can move on to the next town, depending on, again, where your players end up and how they decide to tackle it. Now, it gets a little more disappointing if your players go ahead and say, okay, well, in going up here to East Haven and Goodmead, we've already missed the dragon, we've seen the destruction, we've seen its path, so we're just going to go ahead and Bryn Shander and defend the town. Then it gets a little trickier and maybe a little less exciting, because your players actually, if you look at the number, at the time it takes, let's see, I think that's under, Dragon Scourge. First of all, the time it takes to fly. Now, the dragon doesn't have to sleep or eat or anything. It's a construct, so it's just on this path. But it still takes a while to fly from one town to another. And, like I said, it spends anywhere from half an hour to 6 or 8 hours in one location. I mean, I think it spends, 8 hours in East Haven destroying this town. So I did kind of a rough math estimate, and it feels like it takes 3 or 4 days for the dragon to actually go around, and even until I think it arrives in East Haven. I think I wrote down maybe like Bryn Shander. Day 4 it actually arrives in Bryn Shander. So presumably if your players make a beeline to Bryn Shander, they actually have like a couple days to prepare, and then it becomes a different event because you'll start have refugees trickling in, and you can start trying to mount these defenses, and especially once those refugees come in, then the town will be like, okay, yeah, because oddly enough, you might not even, some towns are forewarned about this dragon coming, and others are not. People don't have like phones and email and shit right here. It's just, and it's a pretty low magic area in terms of like sending spells. So there's a good chance that a lot of these people might not realize it. It does specifically mention the people of Lonelywood are prepared. They actually witness the dragon. Like the fisher people, fisher folks can see it. I guess 2 miles away, they can see the destruction, so they flee back to Lonelywood. And it says most of the population actually flees the town. By the time the dragon gets there and destroys it, most of the population survives, which is, I think, the only one in the case where the town gets some forewarning. But otherwise, a lot of people probably wouldn't even, one of the challenges would be like convincing town folk that the dragon is coming. And once refugees start approaching, they absolutely would. But so you'll have to worry about what kind of defenses can they actually mount. Like what capabilities does the militia have? Do they just have a bunch of crossbows or just shooting at this thing? In which case, we obviously don't want to run combat for that. We want to treat it as like, okay, the dragon's taking this much damage and it's doing this thing. And I would still create a scenario there where, you can have the militia be, even if the players have done everything right, you can have the militia firing at this dragon. And, and it mentions like how many hit points the dragon loses depending on how many cities it's been in. So, you've lost most of 10 towns, but it's taken, 20 damage or something. And you'll just have to gauge as a DM, like at what point you want to bring the dragon down, because that's when things get really interesting. Once the dragon is landed, suddenly it can deal a shit ton of damage, but it also gives your players a chance to actually fight it more toe-to-toe. But it's a very tricky line to walk because, as I mentioned, that thing does so much damage with its multi-attack. I mean, you've got 4 attacks here, average of 15 damage or so. It still has magic resistance. Siege monster, I mean, nothing, buildings don't have hit points, so just assume that it's just crashing things left and right. I think if done well, this can be a really fun chapter, but it's going to be very, very tricky and require a lot of extra effort from the DM. Obviously, have those maps prepared, have those events prepared too, and you're not going to know which town or what decisions the players necessarily make unless you're really lucky with like one session ends with like, okay, where do you guys want to go? You've seen the dragon take off. What do you want to do? Hopefully you'll have that preparation, but you may not be able to prepare on which town they're arriving in, but at least you should have a number of events like invisible Dwergar are attacking people, or Dwergar saboteurs are, collapsing buildings or things. There could be, let's see, what else is mentioned? Thieves. You could have just assholes just looting the town. You could also have the malevolent townsfolk thing where but note that the dragon basically has to land. It's a 30-foot range to actually give that charming ability off, and it lasts for a minute, so pretty much just while the dragon's Actually, not even, because I mean it could be there for 30 minutes or something. So but that could be something your players have to wrestle with, is see a bunch of townsfolk come up with weapons. I would probably, rather than use commoners, I might even use like the bandit stat block or something, but maybe just give them one attack. But make it so that commoners are, at least enough of a interesting combat scenario your players have to deal with. And obviously, remember, dwargers can be invisible, they can enlarge themselves, they can cause all kinds of havoc. And that's the kind of stuff that your players should deal with. Yes, the dragon should be an ultimate threat, and it would be cool to take it down. But you don't even necessarily have to, because once the dragon destroys everything, it basically just flies back to Sunblight, and then if you've cleared Sunblight, then the dragon is not going to come back, ostensibly. But I think it works better story-wise if your players can take down the dragon, but it's going to need a lot of help, and I would hopefully, I mean, I don't see any way of the players preventing it from at least taking out like half of 10 Towns. I think the best case scenario is if your players kind of followed along like groupies, like roadies on a band. They follow this dragon along and have multiple scenarios with it, or maybe try to get ahead of it at certain areas. Maybe they really like certain towns. They've done some quests there. They like those NPCs. They want to try to go save them and protect them. That would be really effective. And then maybe chip off some hit points from certain events. But I wouldn't necessarily stop them if they want to just go to, Bryn, Shander, or whatever you want to use. And if they just want to hold up there for a couple days and build up the strengths and defenses and let, the rest of the 10 Towns region get destroyed, which is something I would definitely explain to the players if they choose that. Like, all right, but given the information, assuming they've got that flight path, like, it's going to go around and just destroy everything. Which the good news is, if you keep Sunblight down here and your players make it to either Dugan's Hole, Goodmead, or Easthaven, those are the first areas the dragon should end up in, and it should be doing its work already. Although, if you do it like I do and allow travel to happen a lot faster, there is a chance they will actually arrive in, if they go to Easthaven first, and you keep Sunblight over in this general area, there's a good chance they'll arrive in Easthaven while the dragon's still attacking, which could be very effective, because that is immediately showcases the dragon's destruction, showcase its power. Maybe it's like leaving, just as the players arrive, and now your players have to start making a decision whether they try to follow it or get ahead of it, or what they try to do. So a lot of it depends on your players, but that's, D&D in general depends on the players. And then, as I mentioned with Valine, because that's a part of Chapter 4 as well, I would introduce her later. I would not have her just show up as a very suspicious person, like in the middle of going back to town from Easthaven, and have her offer the players a ride. That just feels weird. Instead, wherever the players have probably their biggest showdown, probably the final showdown with the dragon, which is probably going to be Bryn Shander, that's when I would introduce Valine as almost just a random person that just shows up and starts helping the rest of the party, kind of like, I don't know, Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver in the Age of Ultron, although I guess they were introduced earlier than that, but they were allowed to be, heroes in that section. Valine would definitely, I see her as helping the players out, because she ultimately wants the players' help in doing all the first stuff. Now, I have some big ideas, and I'll talk about that next time, on how to better integrate the whole Arcane Brotherhood, Valine, Auril storyline into the rest of the chapters. But otherwise, I'm okay with having this be kind of a nice little bow on the events. Keep in mind, however, and I want to mention this during this one, if your players have any outstanding Chapter 2 quests left, make sure you've put a big note on which ones you want your players to do before the Sunblight event, which to me encompasses the actual dungeon and the dragon attack, so Chapter 3 and 4 are linked, and afterwards, because most of 10 Towns is most likely going to be destroyed in this event. So it doesn't make any sense for somebody to be like, hey, can you go take care of those goblins for us? Yeah, Crocoloke. Like, at this point, every quest is going to be like, oh my god, can you help us just rebuild our poor, entire city and infrastructure? And we just need, it's like any place that's just completely destroyed. Like, we need, water and, basic supplies and food and all this shit. All these other side quests are just bullshit. So make sure you've got a pretty clear line on which ones are I want you to go do this thing, which should be before these events, versus stuff that's just, you've heard about this and you can go anytime, such as the Dark Duchess or the It Ascendant, or stuff like that doesn't have anything to do with necessarily a quest giver giving you the quest to go do the thing. So, make sure you put a delineation there, because the entire tone, you can run it as dark as you want, but obviously this is the darkest event that happens, because it literally destroys most of these cities. And be aware that Yeah, it's tricky because you don't want to put like a video game ass thing where it's like, hey, make sure you complete all your quests before you go here, because that's maybe telling too much. But as a DM, instead, you know, not even give those quests that, or give those quests earlier, I guess, that matter that much more, and try to put Sunblight out far, and hopefully your players can figure out to get those done beforehand, or else. Sorry, we might not care about as much as these guys. I mean, goblins, I guess, might still be a problem, but it feels weird narratively to still tackle those after these big events happen. And unfortunately, after this big event, Ten Towns doesn't really become a thing anymore. Like, you kind of end up going after Auril and going after the city, and you've almost forgotten about all these major, huge problems and this huge event that just happened. So it might be worth including some, I don't know, narrative beats or maybe a few side quests of just helping around and trying to, like, bring supplies in or do some. I guess the best thing you can do is to stop the everlasting winter. So it makes sense where you're going after Auril. But then the final finale where it's like, okay, we've stopped that, but now we're just going to go do our own thing and loot the city. Like, there are better ways you can try to link those things together. I'll be talking about that in the future. By the way, a big problem obviously is Auril never showing up during these early things. One of the coolest things you could do is take a page from like kaiju movies and have her freaking show up during the Shardle and Dragon attack, riding her rock or something and trying to fight off. Because I look at it as this is her domain, this is her stuff. She doesn't want another giant, monster coming in and taking over. And obviously the Dwargar would be a bit of a threat there. She doesn't necessarily care about the people there, but she wants followers, and the Dwargar are not going to be following her at all. So that would still be a threat to her domain. So I think that would be a really fun way to show her off, show her power, and that could be a way to ground the dragon. Now the dragon is immune to cold, so Auril would not be nearly effective as she would want to be. And I would note that is something the player should realize. And I would also do some fun things with Shardolin in my campaign, where it's like, you get those shards and that becomes like her kryptonite and all that. Could be really cool. But have her show up and have her either, wound the dragon, maybe with a rock or something, and have it be to where maybe she's the one that even lands the dragon, and then maybe she has to even retreat, or something happens where the players ultimately get to, don't take it away from the players necessarily, unless they're in a really bad way and they just do not want to fight the dragon. Then you can have that event happen and weaken it so much where the players could try and get in there and do it, or just turn it into a cutscene kaiju battle, like whatever you think would work the best. All right, so I think that will do it for Chapter 4, and next week we will start tackling really when we have to start doing a lot more work. I've very much enjoyed these first few chapters. I think it tells a very cool story that has a cool trajectory, and obviously Chapter 1 and 2 has a whole bunch of modular stuff to add, which you can keep doing Chapter 2 stuff after here, but starting at, especially with 5, because 6 and 7 is basically the finale area. Those two are linked also. 5, I think, needs a lot of work to make it more than just to go here and do this one thing. So we'll be talking a lot about that next time. Thank you all for watching this video.